The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal gardens of Verdun Prime as students made their way to the Galactic Academy. The academy stood like a jewel among the peaceful hills, its white towers reaching toward the sky. For 300 years, only the most gentle species in the galaxy had walked these halls, Lisa. Chen adjusted her flower crown as she hurried across the courtyard. The Corvin student's petals shimmered with morning dew, and her leaf-like hair rustled in the breeze. She was excited about the new term, but also nervous. Word had spread that something unusual was happening today. "Did you hear the news?" whispered Marcus, a tall Thalorian whose bark-like skin gleamed with silver streaks. His branch arms swayed as he walked beside Lisa. "Professor Velthus called an emergency meeting. They say we're getting new students." Lisa's flower petals dimmed slightly. "New students? But the term started 2 weeks ago. It's very strange." Around them, other students gathered in small groups, their voices mixing like wind chimes. The Zephyrians' crystalline bodies caught the light, creating rainbow patterns on the ground. The Aquan students moved like flowing water, their translucent forms rippling with each step. All of them were plantators, creatures of peace, who had never known violence. Professor Velthus stood at the front of the main classroom, her crystal horns gleaming. She was old, even by Zephyrian standards, and had taught at the academy for over 2 centuries. Her usually calm demeanor seemed strained today. "Students, please take your seats," she said, her voice carrying the musical tone of her species. "We have important matters to discuss before our new classmates arrive." The students settled into their biochairs, which adjusted to fit each species perfectly. Lisa sat near the window, where she could feel the warm sunlight on her petals. Marcus took the seat beside her, his roots extending into the floor's nutrient channels. "As you know," Professor Velthus began, "the Galactic Academy has always been a place of peace and learning. We have welcomed students from across the galaxy, united in our commitment to harmony and understanding." She paused, and Lisa noticed her crystal form flickering slightly. This was a sign of stress in Zephyrians. However, the Galactic Council has issued new guidelines. They believe our academy should represent all species, not just those who share our dietary preferences. A murmur ran through the classroom. Amy, a young Florian whose stem-like body was covered in soft moss, raised her hand. "Professor, what do you mean by dietary preferences?" Professor Velthus's light dimmed further. "Today we will be joined by 2 new students. One is from a species that has never attended our academy before. The other is from a world that the Galactic Council has classified as extremely dangerous." The students exchanged worried glances. Lisa felt her petals close slightly, a natural response to stress. She had never encountered anything dangerous in her entire life. Corvin Prime was a world of endless gardens and gentle rains. "I want you all to remember our core teachings," Professor Velthus continued. "We believe in the power of understanding and compassion. Today we'll test those beliefs." Before anyone could ask more questions, the classroom door slid open. Lisa turned to look and immediately felt her entire body freeze in terror. The creature that entered was like nothing she had ever seen. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light. Its arms were longer than its legs, ending in hands that bore claws as long as Lisa's fingers. When it opened its mouth to speak, she could see rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Greetings," the creature said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "I am Krax of the Vorthok Empire. I am here to learn your ways of peace." Several students gasped. Amy actually fainted, her moss-covered form toppling from her chair. Marcus's branches trembled so violently that leaves fell to the floor. Lisa had heard stories of the Vorthok, whispered tales that parents used to frighten children into good behavior. They were hunters, killers who stalked their prey across entire star systems. Their ships were black as space itself, and they took what they wanted by force, and now one of them was standing in their classroom. "Please, take a seat, Professor," Velthus said, though her voice shook slightly. She gestured to a reinforced chair that had been placed at the back of the room. Krax moved with surprising grace for such a large creature. Each step was deliberate and silent, like a predator stalking prey. Lisa noticed that his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room and cataloging every student's position. As Crack settled into his chair, which creaked under his weight, the door opened again. This time a much smaller figure entered. The new student was barely 5.5 feet tall, with smooth pink skin and brown hair that fell in waves around his face. Unlike Crack's, he looked completely harmless. His teeth were small and blunt, his hands soft and lacking any claws. He wore simple clothes and carried a worn leather bag. "Hi, everyone," he said with a warm smile. "I'm Jake Martinez from Earth. I'm really excited to be here." The contrast was so stark that Lisa almost laughed. After the terrifying entrance of Cracks, this human seemed like a gentle breeze after a storm. His voice was soft and friendly, and his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Jake, please take a seat," Professor Velthus said, sounding relieved. She gestured to a normal chair near the front of the room. Jake walked to his seat with an easy, relaxed gait. Unlike Cracks, he seemed to pay little attention to his surroundings, nodding politely to students as he passed. When he sat down, he pulled out a small notebook and pen, ready to take notes like any other student. "Now then," Professor Velthus said, trying to regain her composure. "Perhaps our new students would like to introduce themselves properly." Crack stood first, his massive form casting a shadow across half the classroom. "I am Cracks, son of Vorthok Prime. My people are warriors and hunters. We have never known defeat in battle." His voice carried pride and barely contained violence. "I come here because the Council of Elders believes we must learn new ways. The galaxy is changing, and we must change with it." He sat down with a thud. That shook the floor. Several students whimpered quietly. Jake stood next, seeming even smaller after Crax's imposing presence. "I'm Jake Martinez," he said again, his voice gentle and calm. "I come from a place called Earth. It's a pretty planet with lots of different environments and creatures. I'm here because I want to learn how different species can work together peacefully." He smiled again, and Lisa felt herself relaxing slightly. This human seemed kind and thoughtful, nothing like the dangerous creature she had expected. "My people have always been curious about other worlds and cultures," Jake continued. "I hope I can learn from all of you and maybe share some things about humans too." As Jake sat down, Lisa noticed something odd. While his words were friendly and his manner relaxed, his eyes had briefly met those of every student in the room. It was subtle, but she had caught it. For just a moment, she had felt like he was studying her, but the feeling passed quickly. She decided she must have imagined it. Professor Velthus cleared her throat. "Thank you both. Now let's begin today's lesson on interspecies communication. We'll start with the basic principles of peaceful dialogue." As the lesson progressed, Lisa found herself stealing glances at the two new students. Crack sat perfectly still, his predator's eyes fixed on the professor. Occasionally he would nod or grunt agreement, but he never spoke unless directly asked. Jake, on the other hand, was the perfect student. He took detailed notes, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in every topic. When Professor Velthus discussed the importance of understanding other cultures, Jake nodded enthusiastically. "That's so important," Jake said during a discussion break. "My grandmother always said that the best way to avoid conflict is to understand what the other person really needs." The other students began to warm up to him. His friendly manner and obvious intelligence made him easy to like. By the end of the class, several students had already invited Jake to join their study groups. Cracks, meanwhile, remained isolated. As the students filed out of the classroom, they gave the massive Vorthok a wide berth. His very presence seemed to radiate danger, and nobody wanted to get too close. Lisa walked out with Marcus and Amy, who had recovered from her fainting spell. They talked quietly as they headed to their next class. "The human seems nice," Amy said, her voice still shaky from the earlier shock. "Much better than I expected." "Yes," Marcus agreed, his bark rustling thoughtfully. "He's very polite and seems genuinely interested in peace. I think you'll fit in well." Lisa nodded, but something nagged at her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jake Martinez than met the eye. But compared to the obvious threat that Cracks represented, her small doubts seemed silly. As they walked toward their next class, Lisa glanced back at the classroom. Through the window, she could see Jake helping Professor Velthus clean up some papers that had fallen during Amy's fainting spell. He was smiling and chatting pleasantly, every inch the helpful, harmless student. But for just a moment, as Jake handed the papers to Professor Velthus, Lisa saw something in his eyes that made her petals close slightly. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that same warm, friendly expression. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the human was not quite what he seemed. 3 days had passed since the new students arrived, and the academy had settled into an uneasy routine. The herbivorous students moved through the halls in tight groups, whispering nervously whenever cracks appeared. The massive Vorthok seemed to fill every space he entered, his dark scales absorbing light like a walking shadow. Lisa sat in the cafeteria with her usual friends, picking at her morning nutrients. The specialized food dispensers provided perfect meals for each species, but today her appetite was poor. Across the room, Cracks sat alone at a reinforced table, methodically consuming what looked like raw meat from his homeworld. "Look at those teeth," whispered Amy, her moss trembling slightly. "How can something that dangerous be allowed here?" Marcus nodded, his bark-like skin darkening with worry. Yesterday in conflict resolution class, he talked about honor through combat. He actually said that sometimes violence is the only answer. The professor looked terrified, added Ben, a young Aquan whose water form rippled with anxiety. "I think she's afraid he might attack someone." Lisa watched Cracks eat, noting how he held his food with those terrible claws. Every movement was controlled and precise, like a machine built for killing. When other students walked past his table, he would pause and watch them with those predator eyes until they were gone. "At least the human is normal," Amy said, sounding relieved. "Jake is so nice and friendly. He helped me with my botany homework yesterday." Lisa looked around the cafeteria until she spotted Jake at a corner table. He was eating what appeared to be fruits and vegetables from the standard herbivore selection. His table was surrounded by several students who seemed completely at ease in his presence. Jake was telling some kind of story, and the students around him were laughing. His hands moved as he spoke, and his face was animated with expression. Everything about him suggested warmth and friendliness. "He asked me about Florian music traditions," Amy continued. "He was so interested in how we use sound to help plants grow. He said humans have music too, and he'd love to share some with us." "See?" Marcus said, his branches swaying with relief. "That's exactly what a peaceful species should be like. Curious about others. Wanting to share knowledge. Nothing like that monster." As if summoned by their conversation, Cracks stood up from his table. The scraping of his chair against the floor created a harsh sound that made several students flinch. He walked toward the food dispensers. Students scrambled to get out of his way. Lisa watched nervously as the massive creature approached their section of the cafeteria. For a moment, it looked like he might stop at their table, and she felt her petals begin to close in fear, but Cracks simply walked past them without a glance, got his food, and returned to his isolated table. Still, the encounter left Lisa's heart beating rapidly. "Did you see that?" Ben whispered. "He didn't even acknowledge us. It's like we're just prey animals to him. Professor Velthus says we should try to understand him," Amy said doubtfully. "But how can you understand something that only thinks about hunting and killing?" Their conversation was interrupted by a cheerful voice. "Mind if I join you?" Jake stood beside their table, holding a tray of colorful fruits and vegetables. His smile was warm and genuine, and Lisa felt herself relaxing immediately. "Of course," she said, making room on the bench. "Please sit down." Jake settled beside them, and the atmosphere at the table immediately improved. His presence seemed to push away the dark mood that Cracks had created. "I hope you don't mind me asking, Jake," said, "but I'm really curious about your homeworlds. Earth only has one type of intelligent species, so this is all fascinating to me." Amy perked up immediately. "What's Earth like? Is it as peaceful as it sounds?" "Oh, it's beautiful," Jake replied, taking a bite of what looked like a purple fruit. "We have huge forests, deep oceans, mountains that touch the sky. Lots of different environments and creatures." "Oh, what kind of creatures?" Marcus asked, genuinely interested. Jake's eyes seemed to light up. All kinds. We have animals that swim, fly, run, crawl. Some are tiny, some are enormous. We have creatures that live in the deepest parts of the ocean, and others that soar high. Above the clouds? Are they dangerous? Lisa asked, then immediately felt silly for the question. Jake laughed, but it was a gentle sound. Some of them can be, but mostly they just want to live their lives like everyone else. Humans have learned to coexist with them. We study them, protect them, and they're part of what makes Earth special. Ben leaned forward, his water form shimmering. With curiosity, do humans ever fight with each other? For just a moment, something flickered across Jake's face. It was gone so quickly that Lisa thought she might have imagined it. Sometimes, Jake admitted, but we're always working to find better ways to solve problems. That's actually why I'm here. I want to learn how other species handle disagreements peacefully. The conversation continued pleasantly as Jake asked thoughtful questions about each of their cultures. He seemed genuinely fascinated by Amy's description of the singing forests on Florian Prime, and he listened intently as Marcus explained how Thalorians communicated through root networks. That's amazing, Jake said. On Earth, we have to rely on sound and visual signals to communicate. The idea of connecting directly through biological networks is incredible. Lisa found herself warming to the human. He was nothing like the terrifying stories she had heard about Deathworld species. Jake seemed curious, intelligent, and genuinely interested in learning about peaceful coexistence. Their pleasant conversation was interrupted by a commotion across the cafeteria. Krax had stood up again, but this time he was facing another student. Carl, a Zephyrian with particularly bright crystal formations, had apparently said something that offended the Vorthok. The two were standing face to face, with Carl's crystalline body flickering nervously while Krax loomed over him like a dark storm cloud. Your people are weak, Krax was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. You hide behind your pretty crystals and speak of peace, but you have never faced real danger. You do not understand what strength means. Carl's light was flickering rapidly now, a sign of extreme distress in Zephyrians. We believe that true strength comes from understanding and cooperation, not violence. Krax made a sound that might have been laughter, but it was more like the growl of a hunting beast. Understanding? Cooperation? These are the words of prey animals who have forgotten how to survive. The entire cafeteria had gone silent. Students pressed themselves against walls and behind tables, trying to stay as far away from the confrontation as possible. Even the floating food dispensers seemed to hover more quietly than usual. That's enough, Professor Velthus's voice rang out as she entered the cafeteria. Her crystal form was blazing with authority, but Lisa could see the stress. Fractures in her light. Krax turned to face the professor, and for a moment, Lisa thought he might challenge her too. But instead, he simply nodded once and returned to his seat. Carl, please come with me, Professor Velthus said gently. The young Zephyrian was still flickering with distress as he followed her out of the cafeteria as soon as they were gone. The normal sounds of the cafeteria slowly returned. Students began whispering nervously about what they had witnessed. See what I mean? Amy said, her voice shaking. He's dangerous. Doesn't belong here. Jake had been quiet during the entire confrontation, but now he spoke thoughtfully. He's probably just scared. Everyone at the table turned to stare at him. Scared? Ben's water form rippled with disbelief. That thing isn't afraid of anything. Think about it, Jake said calmly. He's completely alone here, surrounded by beings who are nothing like him. Everyone fears him. Nobody wants to talk to him. He's probably defensive because he feels isolated. Lisa considered this. She hadn't thought about how Krax might be feeling. But he threatened Carl, did he? Jake asked. I heard him say Carl's people were weak, but I didn't hear any actual threats. It sounded more like he was trying to prove himself, to show that his way of thinking has value too. Amy shook her head. You're too kind, Jake. That creature is a predator. They don't have feelings like we do. Jake was quiet for a moment, staring across the cafeteria at Krax's isolated table. Maybe you're right, he said finally. I just think everyone deserves a chance to be understood. The rest of lunch passed quietly. Students remained nervous and jumpy, glancing frequently at Krax's table. The Vorthok continued eating in silence, apparently unbothered by the tension he had created. Jake, meanwhile, continued to be the perfect student. He asked more questions about their cultures, shared interesting facts about Earth and generally helped everyone feel more relaxed. By the time lunch ended, the students at Lisa's table were laughing again as they prepared to leave for afternoon classes. Lisa noticed something odd. While Jake had been talking and laughing with them, his eyes had occasionally drifted toward Crax's table. But it wasn't the fearful glances that other students were giving the predator. Jake's looks seemed more like he was studying the Vorthok, analyzing him the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen. But whenever someone at their table spoke to him, Jake's attention immediately returned, and his friendly smile never wavered. Walking to their next class, Ermi chatted happily about how nice it was to have Jake at the academy. 2 weeks later, Professor Velthius announced the field exercise that would change everything. The class would travel to Nexus Station, a neutral trading post where beings from across the galaxy came to do business. Their assignment was simple: use diplomacy in peaceful negotiation to gather resources for a hypothetical colony. This is your chance to put theory into practice, Professor Velthius explained as they boarded the transport ship. You'll be given credits to trade with, but remember, no violence, no threats, only peaceful persuasion. Lisa felt excited but nervous as she settled into her seat. This would be her first time off Verdun Prime since starting at the academy. Beside her, Amy was practically glowing with anticipation, her moss shimmering with bright colors. Jake sat across the aisle looking relaxed and friendly as always. He had struck up a conversation with Ben about water recycling systems, asking detailed questions about Aquan technology with genuine interest. Crax occupied 2 seats at the back of the transport, its massive form barely fitting in the space. Other students had clustered as far away from him as possible, leaving him isolated once again. The flight to Nexus Station took several hours. During the journey, Jake entertained several students with stories about Earth, music, and art. He described concerts where thousands of humans would gather to listen to songs and museums filled with beautiful paintings and sculptures. It sounds wonderful, Amy said dreamily, so peaceful and creative. Humans have always found ways to express themselves, Jake replied with that warm smile. Art helps us understand each other and find common ground. When they arrived at Nexus Station, Lisa was amazed by the size and complexity of the structure. The station was enormous, with multiple levels and sections dedicated to different types of trade. Beings from dozens of species moved through the corridors, creating a maze of colors, sounds, and smells. Professor Veltis gathered the students in the main concourse. Remember, you have 6 hours to complete your trading assignments. Each of you has been given a list of resources your colony needs and credits to acquire them. Meet back here when you're finished. She handed out data pads with their individual assignments and credit chips. Lisa looked at her list: food supplies, medical equipment, and communication devices. The credits seemed like a reasonable amount, but she had never actually traded for anything before. Good luck, everyone, Jake said cheerfully. I'm sure we'll all do great. The students scattered in different directions, eager to begin their assignments. Lisa decided to start with food supplies and headed toward a section that seemed to specialize in agricultural products. The first few hours went reasonably well for most of the herbivorous students. They approached vendors politely, explained their needs clearly, and managed to make several successful trades. Their natural, gentle manner and obvious innocence made many traders willing to help them. Lisa had managed to acquire most of her food supplies and was feeling confident as she searched for medical equipment. The vendors seemed to find her flower-like appearance charming. Several had given her better deals than she had expected. But things were not going well for everyone. Crax was having serious problems. Despite his best efforts to be polite, his appearance terrified most of the traders. When he approached stalls, vendors would either flee immediately or refuse to deal with him entirely. His deep, rumbling voice and massive claws made even his friendliest attempts at conversation sound threatening. Lisa watched from across a marketplace. Cracks tried to negotiate for mining equipment. The trader, a nervous Quillen with feathered skin, kept backing away from Crax's table. "I do not wish violence," Crax was saying, his voice carefully controlled. "I offer fair trade for these tools." But the Quillen trader was too frightened to listen. "Please, honored predator, I have family. Take what you want, just don't hurt me." Crax's shoulders sagged with frustration. "I do not want to take. I want to trade. This is the way of peace." "Yes." The trader fled, leaving his goods behind. Crax stood alone at the abandoned stall, looking lost and confused. For the first time since meeting him, Lisa felt genuinely sorry for the Vorthok. Meanwhile, other students were running into different problems. Amy had been swindled by a smooth-talking Nexon trader who sold her medical supplies that turned out to be decorative crystals. Ben had been convinced to trade all his credits for what he thought was advanced water purification equipment. It was actually a children's toy. Marcus had fallen for an elaborate story about rare seeds that would supposedly grow into trees that produced every type of fruit imaginable. He had spent most of his credits on what were obviously ordinary plant seeds from some trader's garden. The herbivorous students' trusting nature and sheltered upbringing made them easy targets for unscrupulous dealers. They believed every sob story, accepted every claim at face value, and rarely questioned prices that were obviously inflated. But Jake was having remarkable success. Lisa first noticed it when she saw him completing a complex trade with a group of Korthok merchants. The Korthok were known throughout the galaxy as shrewd business people who rarely gave anyone a good deal. Yet Jake was walking away from their stall with everything on his list and credits left over. Curious. Lisa followed Jake discreetly as he moved through the station. What she saw made her increasingly uncomfortable. Jake seemed to know exactly what to say to every trader he met. With the proud Zenthran merchants, he spoke respectfully about their culture and traditions. With the profit-focused Nexans, he discussed business opportunities and mutual benefits. With the family-oriented Qualians, talked about community and caring for loved ones. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how he knew what to say. Jake seemed to understand each species' psychology, their cultural values, their weaknesses and desires. He negotiated like someone who had studied these beings for years. At one stall, Lisa watched Jake convince a Repthan trader to sell him expensive communication equipment for half the asking price. The Repthan, known for being cold and logical, was actually smiling by the end of their conversation. "How did you know about the mining rights dispute on Repthan 7? Trader asked Jake as they completed their deal. "I make it my business to stay informed about galactic affairs," Jake replied casually. "Information is valuable in any negotiation." The Repthan nodded approvingly. "Wise words, human. Your species shows promise." Lisa felt a chill run through her petals. How did Jake know about obscure mining disputes on distant worlds? When did he have time to learn about galactic politics in such detail? Her unease grew as she continued watching Jake work. He moved through the station with confidence, never seeming lost or confused like the other students. He knew which sections sold which goods, which traders were reputable, and which deals were worth pursuing. Most disturbing of all, Jake seemed to know personal information about the traders he dealt with. He asked about their families, their homeworlds, their business concerns. The traders responded as if they were talking to an old friend, never questioning how this human student knew so much about their lives. "Your daughter must be excited about starting at the Academy of Sciences," Jake said to a Florian trader who was selling medical supplies. The trader's stem brightened with pleasure. "You know about Petal? How wonderful." "Yes, she's very excited. It's been her dream since she was a seedling." Jake smiled warmly. "I'm sure she'll do wonderfully." Florian students are known for their dedication to healing arts. As Jake completed another successful trade, Lisa realized something that made her flower petals close tight with fear. Jake wasn't just a good negotiator. He was operating with information that no ordinary student should have. He knew personal details about traders, political situations on distant worlds, and cultural practices of dozens of species. It was as if he had access to detailed intelligence, files on everyone he met, The revelation became undeniable when the pirates attacked. Lisa was in the communication equipment section, trying to recover from a bad trade, when the lights suddenly dimmed and alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency announcements echoed through the corridors in multiple languages. Attention, all beings. This station is now under the control of the Red Nova pirate fleet. Remain calm and comply with all instructions. Lisa's petals went completely pale with terror. She had never experienced anything like this in her sheltered life. Around her, other traders and customers were panicking, some running for exits that were already being sealed. A group of armed pirates entered the section, their weapons drawn and ready. There were a mixed crew of different species, all looking dangerous and experienced. Their leader was a scarred Vorthok, who seemed even more intimidating than Krax. "Everyone on the ground," the leader shouted. "Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt." Lisa dropped to her knees, trembling with fear. Beside her, Amy was so terrified that her moss had turned completely gray. Ben's water form was rippling uncontrollably with panic. The other herbivorous students were equally terrified. They had never faced violence before, never been threatened or endangered. Their peaceful upbringing had left them completely unprepared for this situation. Even Marcus, despite his tree-like strength, was frozen with fear. Ark had darkened to almost black, and his branches were pulled tight against his body. What happened next would be burned into Lisa's memory for the rest of her life. The pirate leader raised his weapon, clearly intending to force Jake to the ground. But Jake moved first, and his movement was nothing like the gentle human the students had come to know. Jake's transformation was instant and terrifying. The friendly student disappeared, replaced by something that moved like liquid death. He ducked under the pirate's weapon, grabbed a metal tool from the nearby stall, and drove it into the pirate's knee with surgical precision. The pirate leader screamed and fell, but Jake was already moving to the next target. He rolled behind. A counter as the other pirates opened fire, their energy weapons scorching the air where he had been standing. "Kill the human," one of the pirates shouted. "Take the others alive." But Jake had vanished into the maze of market stalls like a ghost. The pirates spread out, trying to find him, but they were no longer the hunters. They had become the prey. Lisa pressed herself against the floor, too terrified to move. Around her, the other herbivorous students were sobbing with fear. This was beyond anything they had ever imagined. Violence was supposed to be something that happened to other people, far away from their peaceful lives. The first pirate died quietly. Lisa didn't see it happen, but she heard the soft thud of a body hitting the ground. The remaining pirates began calling to each other nervously, realizing that one of their team was no longer responding. "Where is he?" The pirate voice called out. "Report in." Silence. Jake's voice came from somewhere in the darkness between the stalls. "There are 8 of you left. The Galactic Peacekeepers pay 5,000 credits per Red Nova pirate, dead or alive. That's 40,000 credits total." His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Lisa couldn't tell where he was hiding. "Surrender now, and I'll let you leave the station alive," Jake continued. "Keep fighting, and I'll collect the bounty on all of you." One of the pirates laughed nervously. "Big talk for one little human." "You're right," Jake's voice replied. "Let me show you what one a little human can do." What followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Jake moved through the market stalls like a force of nature. He used everything as a weapon: tools, furniture, even the stalls themselves. He turned the pirates' own environment against them, creating traps and ambushes that they never saw coming. Lisa caught glimpses of him as he worked. This was not the Jake she knew. This Jake moved with deadly grace, his every action calculated and precise. He fought like someone who had been trained for war, not peace. More disturbing than his skill was his attitude. Jake wasn't angry or frightened. He was calm, almost businesslike, as he systematically eliminated the pirates. He spoke to them as he fought, his voice never losing its polite tone. "You should have taken the offer," he said as another pirate went down. "The peacekeepers really do pay well for your kind." The pirates began to panic. These were hardened criminals who had raided dozens of systems, but they were being hunted by something they didn't understand. Jake wasn't just beating them. He was getting inside their heads, making them afraid. Hey, what are you? One of the pirates screamed as Jake appeared behind him like a shadow. I'm a human, Jake replied calmly. Right before the pirate joined his fallen comrades from her hiding spot, Lisa watched in horror as Jake methodically took apart the pirate crew. He didn't just defeat them, he anticipated their every move, turned their own tactics against them, and made them helpless. The worst part was how easily he did it. Jake wasn't struggling or fighting desperately for his life. He was in complete control, dismantling the pirates like a technician repairing a broken machine. In the distance, Lisa could hear Cracks fighting his own battle. Unlike Jake's silent efficiency, Cracks' approach was direct and loud. His roars echoed through the station as he charged his enemies head-on, using his natural weapons and warrior training. But even Cracks, with all his size and strength, was having trouble. The pirates had better weapons and more numbers. Lisa could hear him being driven back, his roars becoming more desperate. Jake, however, was winning his battle with almost casual ease. The last three pirates tried to regroup near the main entrance, hoping to escape. But Jake was already there, waiting for them. He stood in the doorway, no longer bothering to hide. Going somewhere? He asked politely. The pirates raised their weapons, but Jake was already moving. He disarmed the first one with a move so fast that Lisa barely saw it happen. The second pirate tried to shoot, but Jake used the first pirate's body as a shield. While closing the distance, the third pirate, seeing his companions fall, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Please, don't kill me. I surrender. Jake paused, considering. Smart choice. You can tell your friends in the Red Nova fleet that Nexus Station is under galactic peacekeeper protection now. The pirate nodded frantically. Yes, I'll tell them. We won't come back. See that you don't, Jake said, and he did something. That chilled Lisa to her core. He smiled his old friendly smile. Have a safe trip home. Surviving pirate fled through the emergency exit, leaving his fallen comrades behind. The market section fell silent, except for the sound of alarms and distant fighting from other parts of the station. Jake walked back toward where the students were hiding, and Lisa got her first good look at him since the fighting began. His clothes were torn and dirty, but he wasn't injured. He moved with the same easy grace he had always shown, but now Lisa knew what that grace really meant. Is everyone okay? Jake asked, his voice full of genuine concern. He was back to being the caring, friendly human they thought they knew, but Lisa could see traces of what he really was in his eyes. There was a coldness there that hadn't been present before, calculating intelligence that measured everything and everyone around him. Amy was still too terrified to speak. Marcus had pulled his branches so tight against his body that he looked like a dead tree. Don't be afraid, Jake said gently. The danger is over. Help is coming. As if summoned by his words, station security forces began pouring into the area. But they weren't coming to rescue the students. They were coming to arrest Jake. Drop your weapons and get on the ground. The security chief shouted, pointing his gun at Jake. Jake raised his hands slowly, but he didn't seem worried. I'm Jake Martinez, student at the Galactic Academy. These pirates attacked the station. I was defending myself and the other students. The security chief looked around at the bodies scattered through the market stalls. You did this? All of this? They attacked first, Jake said calmly. I have witnesses. Professor Velthus arrived with the security team, her crystal form blazing with stress and confusion. She looked at the scene of destruction, then at Jake standing calmly in the middle of it all. Jake, she said, her voice shaking. What happened here? Pirates attacked the station, Jake replied. I neutralized the threat to protect the other students. Neutralized. Professor Velthus stared at the fallen pirates. You killed them, some of them, Jake agreed. The others chose to surrender. Or flee. I gave them the option. Cracks appeared in the doorway, supported by 2 security officers. The mighty Vorthok was injured and exhausted from his own battle, his dark scales marked with burn marks from energy weapons. He looked at the scene before him, the dead pirates, the uninjured human, the terrified herbivorous students, and his eyes widened with recognition. Human, Crax said, his voice filled with something like awe. You are Deathworlder, yes? Jake turned to look at the wounded Vorthok. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding that the herbivorous students couldn't grasp. Jake said quietly, I'm from Earth. Crax nodded slowly. This explains much. My people have stories of your kind. We thought they were legends. What stories? Professor Velthius demanded. What is a Deathworlder? Jake sighed, and for the first time since Lisa had known him, he looked tired. It's complicated, Professor. Maybe we should sit down for this conversation? The security chief was still pointing his weapon at Jake, clearly unsure what to do. The human had technically saved the station, but the casual efficiency with which he had killed the pirates was deeply disturbing. Are you going to arrest me? Jake asked politely. I don't know, the security chief admitted. This situation is beyond my experience. I understand, Jake said. Maybe I should explain what humans really are. He looked around at the frightened faces of his classmates, the confused security officers, and the stressed professor. When his eyes met Lisa's, she saw a sadness there that she hadn't noticed before. I never wanted you to see this side of me, Jake said quietly. I came to the academy to learn about peace, not to fight. But you're so good at it, Amy whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded sadly. That's the problem. Humans are very good at fighting. We're very good at a lot of things that most species would rather not think about. Professor Velthus stepped forward, her crystal form flickering with confusion and fear. Jake, I need you. To explain what just happened here, I need you to tell me the truth about what humans really are. Jake looked around the destroyed marketplace one more time, then sat down heavily on a nearby crate. Okay, Professor. But you're not going to like what I have to tell you? Crax limped over and sat down near Jake. The journey back to Verdun Prime was quiet and tense. The students sat in small groups, whispering among themselves and stealing nervous glances at Jake. He had returned to his usual seat, reading quietly from a datapad, but everything about him seemed different now. Lisa watched him from across the transport cabin. Jake looked exactly the same as he had before. Same brown hair, same soft features, same gentle expression. But now she knew what those hands were capable of. She had seen what those calm eyes could calculate in seconds. Amy sat pressed against the window, as far from Jake as she could get. I can't believe we ate lunch with him, she whispered. We invited him to our study groups. He saved our lives, Marcus pointed out, though his bark was still dark with stress. If he hadn't stopped those pirates, we might all be dead. But the way he did it, Ben said, his water form rippling with unease. He killed them like it was nothing, like stepping on insects. Professor Velthus had been quiet for most of the journey, her crystal form dim with deep thought. Finally, she stood and walked to where Jake was sitting. May I join you? She asked. Jake looked up from his reading and smiled. It was the same warm, friendly smile he had always given, but now it carried new meaning. Of course, Professor. She sat down carefully, choosing her words with care. I need to understand something, Jake. When you applied to our academy, did you lie about your intentions? Jake set down his datapad and considered the question seriously. No, Professor. I came here because I genuinely want to learn about peaceful cooperation between species. That's the truth. But you knew what you were capable of course. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact. Every human knows what they're capable of. Have to know. It's part of our survival programming. Professor Velthus flickered with confusion. Survival programming? Jake nodded. Humans are constantly aware of threats, escape routes, potential weapons, and tactical advantages. We can't turn it off any more than you can stop your crystals from growing. It's just how our minds work. So when you were being friendly with the other students, you were also evaluating them as potential threats. Not threats, Jake corrected gently. I was learning about them, understanding their capabilities, their weaknesses, their needs. But not because I wanted to hurt them, because I wanted to understand how to work with them effectively. From across the cabin, Lisa could hear their conversation. She found herself listening despite her fear. Think about it this way, Jake continued. If you wanted to be friends with a Florian, Wouldn't you learn about their need for sunlight and water? If you wanted to trade with a repthon, wouldn't you study their cultural values? When humans just take that process further. How much further? Professor Velthius asked. Jake was quiet for a moment. We know that Zephyrians become sluggish in low-light conditions. We know that Aquans lose cohesion at high temperatures. We know that Thalorians are vulnerable to certain frequencies of sound. We know that Corvins become dormant when separated from plant life for too long. The professor's crystal form began flickering rapidly. You're talking about military intelligence? No, Jake said firmly. I'm talking about basic information that any human child learns in school. We study other species the same way we study Earth animals, not to hunt them, but to understand how to coexist safely. Safely for whom? Professor Velthus asked. Jake looked directly at her. For everyone, Professor. Humans learned a long time ago that the best way to avoid conflict is to understand exactly what everyone is capable of. When you know someone's strengths and limitations, you can work with them more effectively. Their conversation was interrupted by Krax, who had been listening from his seat at the back of the transport. The wounded Vorthok limped over to join them. May I sit? He asked politely. Professor Velthus nodded, though she looked uncomfortable having both predators near her. Krax settled his massive form into a seat that creaked under his weight. Human Jake speaks truth, he said. My people have legends of Deathworlders. We thought they were myths. What kind of legends? Jake asked, seeming genuinely curious. Stories of beings who could hunt the hunters, who could track Vorthok across star systems and defeat them, not with strength, but with patience and intelligence. Krax looked at Jake with something like respect. We thought such creatures could not exist. What changed your mind? Professor Velthus asked. Krax gestured to the healing burn marks on his scales. I fought 6 pirates with weapons and armor. I am trained warrior, born predator. They defeated me easily. He looked at Jake. You fought 8 pirates with better weapons. You had no armor, no training visible to me, yet you won without injury. Jake shook his head. I had plenty of training, Krax. Every human does. We just don't call it training. What do you call it? The Vorthok asked. Education, Jake replied. We learn history, which teaches us about conflict and strategy. We learn biology, which teaches us about different species and their capabilities. We learn engineering, which teaches us how things work and how they can be broken. We learn psychology, which teaches us how minds work and how they can be influenced. Professor Velthus was beginning to understand. So human education is actually comprehensive preparation for conflict. Human education is preparation for survival, Jake corrected. Conflict is just one aspect of survival. Amy had been listening from across the cabin, and now she spoke up, her voice shaking. But why? Why do you need to be so prepared for violence? Jake turned to look at her, his expression sad but patient. Because violence exists in the universe, Amy. We didn't create it, but we can't ignore it either. The pirates who attacked the station today, they exist. They prey on peaceful species because peaceful species are easy targets. But if everyone was peaceful like us, there wouldn't be any violence, Amy insisted. That's a beautiful dream, Jake said gently, but it's not realistic, even on Earth. Before humans became the dominant species, there were predators and prey. The prey animals that survived weren't the ones that ignored the predators, they were the ones that learned to detect and avoid them. Krax nodded agreement. Humans became apex predators, not through strength, but through intelligence. This is why they are dangerous. They think like prey and hunt like predators. I don't think of myself as a predator, Jake said. I think of myself as a protector. I use my abilities to keep others safe. Like you did on the station, Marcus said quietly. He'd been listening to the conversation with growing interest. You protected us. I did what I had to do, Jake replied. But I would have preferred to resolve the situation peacefully. Could you have? Professor Velthus asked. Could you have negotiated with the pirates? Jake considered this seriously. Maybe. Pirates are usually motivated by profit, not violence. If I had something valuable to offer them, or if I could have convinced them that attacking the station would cost them more than they could gain, they might have left peacefully. But you chose violence instead. I chose the option that guaranteed your safety, Jake corrected. Negotiation might have worked, but it also might have failed. When other people's lives are at stake, humans don't gamble with uncertain outcomes. The transport was nearing Verdun Prime now, and the peaceful planet grew larger in the viewports. Looking at the gentle world below, Lisa tried to imagine how it must appear to Jake, not as a safe haven, but as a place where potential threats needed to be identified and neutralized. "Jake," she said suddenly, finding her courage, "when you look at us, do you see friends, or do you see weaknesses to exploit?" Jake turned to her with that same gentle expression he had always worn. "I see friends with weaknesses that I want to protect. And when you look at Cracks," Jake glanced at the massive Vorthok, "I see a fellow predator who chooses to use his strength to protect others instead of dominating them." Crax's scarred face showed what might have been a smile. "Human sees clearly. On Vorthok Prime, we are taught that strength without honor is worthless. It's better to be weak and honorable than strong and corrupt." "That's something humans and Vorthok have in common," Jake said. "We both understand that power comes with responsibility." Professor Velthius had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. "You two are more alike than I realized." In some ways, Jake agreed. "We're both products of dangerous worlds. We both learned that survival requires strength and intelligence. But we also both learned that strength without purpose is meaningless." "So what is your purpose?" she asked. Jake looked out at Verdun Prime as the transport prepared to land. "To learn how to use human capabilities to build something better. To find ways for predators and prey to coexist peacefully. And my purpose," Crax added, "is to prove that predators can be more than just hunters. We can be guardians." As the transport touched down at the academy, Lisa realized that everything had changed. She was still afraid of Jake, but it was a different kind of fear now. She wasn't afraid he would hurt her. She was afraid of what his existence meant for the galaxy. If humans were as intelligent and capable as Jake had demonstrated, what did that mean for species like hers? Would they become obsolete? Protected pets in a universe dominated by apex predators? But as they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the transport, Jake approached her. "Lisa," he said quietly, "I know you're afraid of me now. I understand why.